research I'm doing in New Hampshire on bats and seabirds. So before I jump into my actual research and a little bit of an introduction, I just want to talk a little bit about how I ended up where I am today. So I got my bachelor's in science in biology at St. Mary's College in Indiana, and there I had the opportunity to get involved with several different research projects. So the first one I got involved with was studying an animal called the northern short-tailed shrew, which you can see here on the bottom right. Hopefully you can see my mouse. They're small little rodent-looking guys. They're not rodents, but they look very similar. And they live in forested areas, so we were looking to see if they're possibly using vocalizations to navigate their environment, kind of like bats and dolphins do with echolocation. Then I began studying the alarm calls of fox squirrels to see how they differ during different stress levels. So over here on the bottom left is a picture of a fox squirrel giving a big old yawn. And then finally, during my undergrad, I got involved with a collaborative project with a local zoo where we were trying to see if we could record some vocalizations of Maasai giraffes, pictured here on the top. And they're thought to potentially make some very low pitch vocalizations, but they're not well studied. So that's what we were trying to do. And then after my bachelor's degree, I began my PhD here in New England at the University of New Hampshire, where I started on a project using acoustics to study large colonies of gray bats, which are these guys up here on the right. So they form these clusters where they kind of climb on top of each other. And so within my first couple of weeks in New England, I took a tour of the university's Shoals Marine Laboratory, which is on Appledore Island right off the coast of New Hampshire. And it was on that tour that I learned about a colony of common terns, which are these guys here on the bottom right. And so we have a colony of these common terns off the coast of New Hampshire on a couple islands. And the researchers studying this colony were running into a lot of the same issues that I had seen with the people trying to study bats. So because of the similarities in the common terns and the bats, I decided to just add on common terns to my dissertation. And since then, I have been going out to shoals to study them. So I'm going to talk a whole bunch about them towards the end of my presentation. And again, before I jump into my research, I just want to spend a few minutes talking a bit more broadly about acoustics and animal communication. And so I want to start by asking everyone, why do you think animals make sound? And so you can either just think about this in your head or send your ideas in the chat. I'll just wait a second. Yeah, so a lot of good answers coming in. So mating, communication, looking for food, warnings, these are all great answers. And so yeah, animal communication and animal behavior are the topics that really sparked my passion for this field during my undergrad. And so I wanted to show you guys some examples of some of my favorite sounds and what they're used for. Sound is a key part of animal communication for many different species, and they use sound for many different types of communication. So I'm just going to talk about 4 examples, but there are many more that I could talk about. So the first example is a mating call. So mating is a very common reason that animals make sound. And the example I'm going to play for you today is a male koala bellowing to attract female koalas. And if you haven't had a chance to adjust your volume, now is your warning, because this may be loud if you have your volume up. All right, so that is just such a crazy sound to me, but the lady koalas love it. So the next vocalization I'm going to talk about is Anti-predator or alarm calls. So this is warnings that animals make when they see a threat. This example is a chickadee mobbing call. So black-capped chickadees make this call when they detect a predator in order to warn others. And this call often causes other small birds nearby to swarm the predator in an attempt to scare it away. All right, so the next example is territorial and social calls, and I'm using gray wolves as an example for this because they howl for a multitude of reasons, including territory and social calls. So their howls are used to communicate with pack members over long distances, to locate each other, establish territory, assemble for hunting, and also to send warnings and alerts. And finally, the last example I'm going to talk about today is parent-offspring communication. So I'm going to play a very cute little video of a fawn bleating for its mother. So they make those little cries and mom will come running to help them. All right, and today I'm going to be talking a lot about what's called passive acoustic monitoring, or PAM, as you'll see it referred to. And this is a type of monitoring method that uses microphones to record and study the sounds of animals to answer biological questions and see how animals are interacting with their environment. And it has several key benefits over traditional monitoring methods. It's very cheap. We can put out a lot of acoustic recorders to cover a really wide area and have them out for a very long period of time. It doesn't bother or disturb the animals as much as more traditional methods where we have people actually in the field interacting with the animals a little bit more. And we're also able to go back down the road and look back at our recordings to answer new questions that might come up. And the ultimate goal of passive acoustic monitoring is to better understand animal behavior so that we can more effectively conserve populations of animals. So when we think about analyzing acoustic data, there are two key properties that we're interested in measuring. The first is frequency, or the pitch of sound. So higher frequency is higher pitch, lower frequency is lower pitch. And so infrasound, which is down here on this scale, is considered to be below the range of human hearing, which is generally considered to be about 20 hertz. And so elephants and whales are known to make vocalizations in this infrasonic range. The audible range, for humans at least, so the noises that humans can hear, is considered to be about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And this includes vocalizations of ungulates like deer, amphibians like frogs, birds, and insects. And then finally, we have the ultrasonic range, which is considered to be above what humans can hear. So these are high frequency vocalizations. And this is thought to be 20,000 hertz and higher. So again, we cannot hear these. And the two most common examples that we think of when we think of ultrasonic vocalizations are the echolocation calls of bats and dolphins. And today I'm going to be talking a lot about amplitude, which is the second characteristic that we're often interested in measuring in our acoustic data sets. And amplitude is just another way of saying loudness. So higher amplitude is louder, lower amplitude is quieter. And the standard unit we use to measure amplitude is the decibel, which is abbreviated as dB. And the scale here on the right just shows approximately how many decibels some different common sounds are. So around 30 decibel, we have humans whispering. about 30 decibel, we have general conversation. Up around 90, we have a hair dryer, which is getting to be kind of loud. And then up here at about 130 decibel, we have a jet engine taking off if you were standing right next to it. So this is super loud to the point where we can even start to experience pain. And so I want to ask you guys a couple questions, and you can just think about this in your head and make a guess. So using this scale to the nearest 10 decibel, how loud would you think a cat purring is? So just think about it for a second, make a guess in your head. I'll give you guys a second to think. So again, down here towards the bottom, we have really quiet sounds, and up here, very loud sounds. And so cat purring is right around a whisper, around 30 dB, so a very quiet, soothing sound. And so the second question I want to ask everyone, keeping in mind that we cannot hear bats, because again, they make very high frequency ultrasonic vocalizations, but just using your imagination, how loud do you think an echolocation call could be? So again, think about it for a second, make a guess. How many decibels do you think an echolocation call is? All right, so hopefully everyone has an idea of what they might think. So bat echolocation calls are super loud, around 130 to 140 decibels. So again, similar to a jet engine if you were standing right next to it. So I think we're actually very lucky that we can't hear them, because bats are out all night in the summer foraging for food, making echolocation calls, and I do not think we would be getting very good sleep if we could hear them. And so before I jump into my research, I just want to take a step back to talk about why we monitor animals in the first place. So animal populations are vulnerable with increased human disturbance, and monitoring programs can provide insight into the behavior and ecology of animals, giving us information on things like population size and insight into important events like migration and breeding. And this information is really important for informing conservation and wildlife management decisions to help us protect vulnerable species and populations. And many populations are under-monitored or have no monitoring at all, either due to limited resources for conservation groups or for animals like seabirds and bats. They aggregate in these really difficult to reach places. So seabirds, for example, often nest on remote, rugged islands that are hard to get to, and bats often roost in these really complex cave systems, and they emerge in low light conditions, so it's hard for us to see them when they are out and about. And so my dissertation research focuses on two species from two different taxa. So I study the common tern, which is a type of seabird, found here in New England, and I also study gray bats, which are found throughout the Midwest and Southeast United States. So what do they have in common? So they're both colonial. So common terns form large breeding colonies, and bats form large maternity roosts in the summer months where they both raise young. They are both highly vocal, which is very important for me since I study acoustics, with terns producing vocalizations for all of the purposes I discussed a few slides ago, and bats producing both social calls and echolocation calls that they use to navigate and forage. Lastly, they're both migratory, so they move north during the summer months and south during the colder winter months. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about today is the research I do with bats. So before I move to the next slide, I'm going to need everyone's help on my next slide. So I'm going to play a video, and all I need you guys to do for me is just count the number of bats. So hopefully you guys can do this. All right, so I think you guys see my point. Very hard to count these bats. There are so many of them emerging very quickly. So this is a Brazilian free-tailed bat emergence. These animals are found in the southeast US, and they form some of the largest colonies of bats in the world. In fact, they form the largest colony of bats in the world. And so for colonial species like the Brazilian free-tailed bat, populations can range from thousands to hundreds of thousands to even millions of individuals, and they all emerge within a very short period. And there's no good way to count these animals using traditional methods like this thermal video that I'm showing you, or acoustically. And so it's just really hard to get good estimates of their population size. And so on this slide, before I jump into talking about what I need to say, I just want to orient you to what you're seeing here, these big blue blobs. I'm guessing most of you have not seen this before. These are called spectrograms, and this is how we visualize sound. So on the y-axis over here, we have frequency with lower frequency or lower pitch down towards the bottom and higher frequencies as we move up. We have time on the x-axis, so start is over here and over here. And then the brightness, so these brighter red colors are louder sounds, and the darker blue colors are quieter sounds. So this allows us to actually see sound, which I think is super cool. Before I jump into this, I'm gonna, normally I play a game to demonstrate this idea, but since it's kind of tricky to do over Zoom, I'm just gonna give you all a scenario. So imagine it's just you and your two best friends hanging out in the lunchroom, chatting. It's not too loud, is it? But now imagine you bring everyone in your entire school into a room and everyone is talking with their friends. It gets really loud, right? So it's the same idea with bats. So I'm going to play these two sound clips. So this first one I'm going to play is from this image, the spectrogram on the left, and this is just a single bat calling as it flies past our microphone. And this is slowed down a bunch so that we can hear it, since they make ultrasonic calls. And you can hear it's not too quiet. We just have that single chirp every few seconds. And next I'm going to play what it sounds like when we have hundreds of bats emerging each second. So not only does it get quite a bit louder, I have this obviously turned down a little bit so that it doesn't blow out our speakers, but it gets really hard to be able to tell apart the individual echolocation calls. So using acoustics to monitor bats and to get population estimates isn't uncommon. However, we're typically doing this for individual bats as they're flying around the forest looking for food, and not for these colonial species that emerge in these really large groups. And that's because it is just too hard and too time consuming to parse apart any information given the number of echolocation calls in these spectrograms, other than it's a lot of bats. So we at least know that. But just like the lunchroom example, it's the same idea. We're making an assumption that when there's more animals, it's going to be a louder environment. So we're assuming a relationship, again, between the number of animals and the amplitude. When there's fewer animals, it'll be quieter. When there's more animals, it'll be louder. And so if we can demonstrate that there is a relationship between the number of bats and the amplitude, then we can possibly use amplitude to monitor both population size and activity of these animals at bat colonies. And so to look into these questions, I collected data from 6 different bat colonies, gray bat colonies specifically, which are these guys up here on the top right, in Missouri in the United States. And I collected 2 main types of data. The first type of data I collected is acoustic data, which I used to measure the amplitude or how loud it is during these emergences. And then the second type of data I collected is thermal video data. So I used a special kind of camera that allows us to record bats in the dark so that we can see them. And then I use these videos in a special software to actually count the number of bats emerging from the caves. And so for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about the results that I got from one of the 6 caves I went to. And so this figure here on the left shows the number of bats emerging on the y-axis and the amplitude, or how loud it is, on the x-axis, with quieter over here on the left and louder on the right. And each of these little dots is 1 second of a bat emergence. And each dot tells us at that second how many bats were coming out and how loud it was. And so we're able to look to see if there's a relationship between the number of bats coming out and how loud it is. And that's what these dashed and solid lines are showing, is that relationship. And the different colors are just showing the different nights. And so then if we take all of the dots for each color and we add them up for the whole night, we can get the total number of bats that emerged and the total amplitude for that night. And so by plotting these trends over time with the total number of bats and the total amplitude, we can then start to see how we can use these trends to make specific predictions for individual locations. And if we do this long term, that's how we would be able to monitor changes in population growth and decline. And it could even give us insight into important events like migration, when the bats arrive, when they leave, and even how many babies are being born each season if we see increases around the time we would expect to see baby bats starting to fly. So moving on to seabirds, I'm going to be talking about seabirds for the remainder of my talk. I'm going to be talking about how we use sound to monitor population size and breeding behavior for these colonial birds. Specifically, like I mentioned earlier, I study the common tern, which you can see pictured up here on the upper right. That's just a parent with its two little chick babies. They're super cute. They're about the size of cotton balls when they hatch. Very, very cute. And so the health of seabird populations can tell us a lot about the health of marine ecosystems that they live and forage in. And this gives them the term bioindicators. And unfortunately, nearly half of all seabird species across the globe are declining. So it's really important that we monitor these animals. Common terns specifically are a migratory species of seabird that are found all across the globe. So that's what this map here is showing. The areas in orange and blue and even some purple show where terns spend different parts of the year. So we can see they're found all over the place. And traditionally, we monitor seabird colonies using visual surveys. So investigators actually go out into the colony and they walk around very, very slowly looking for nest. And we use the number of nests to get an estimate of the number of birds that are breeding on the colony each year. And this gets us very accurate counts of the number of birds in these colonies, but it's very expensive and it's very time consuming. And in addition to that, the birds really do not like us being there. They get very upset. And this can cause them to be more aggressive with each other and even to abandon their nest, which is obviously not good and can harm the overall health of the colony. And so I'm going to play a clip here showing how the birds react to us when we're walking around in the colony. And you can hear how loud they are and how aggressively they're diving at us to try and get us to leave. Oops. And so you can see they're not happy with us. It's very loud. It's especially loud when we're in the colony, but it's more or less like that day, morning, night, all the time. They're just very noisy birds. And even though they don't like us being there, it's very important that we understand how the colony is doing in order to protect these animals. So we need to collect information on their population somehow. Passive acoustic monitoring offers a great alternative to these traditional visual methods. We're able to record for days, weeks, months, sometimes even years using acoustic devices. People don't need to spend as much time in the colony, which obviously is a really important benefit since they are not big fans of us being out there. So overall, we can reduce the amount of disturbance by using acoustic methods. And it's also less expensive than visual surveys, which allows us to collect more data. However, like bats, we can't use the individual calls to get population information because there's just too many birds calling at once, and it would take way too long to analyze the data to get information that way. So, like with the bats, I wanted to see if we can use amplitude to monitor population size and breeding behavior at common tern colonies. So to do this, I collected data at the common tern colony on Seavey Island, right off the coast of New Hampshire. And I deployed 11 acoustic recorders across the colony to record amplitude across the entire summer breeding season. So that's from May to August. And here's a picture of me deploying one of my little audio recorders in the colony, and a picture of what the island looks like. It's very beautiful out there in the summer. And what we're finding is that we can use amplitude to get estimates of population size. So what I'm showing you here is called a heat map. And so these green colors for this heat map shows higher nest density. So there's more birds in these green areas. And in the purple areas, there's lower nest density. So there's fewer birds. And then I made a heat map for amplitude, how loud it is. And so again, higher amplitude is these greener areas, lower amplitude is these purple areas. So louder in the green areas, quieter in the purple areas. And we see some similarities. So in these high nest density areas where there's more birds, we see that it's louder when we compare the heat maps. In these low nest density areas where it's purple, we see that it's quieter when we look at the heat map for amplitude. But we do have a couple outliers where we have not very many birds, but it's pretty loud. And that's just likely due to wind and tidal noise since these sites are towards the edge of the island. But we can use special tools to filter out this noise so that we don't have to deal with it when we're doing our statistics to make conclusions about our data set. And so moving on to using amplitude for breeding behavior, we found that we can also use trends in amplitude to understand the different activities taking place in the colony throughout the breeding season. This figure shows amplitude on the y-axis, so quieter down here towards the bottom, louder up here towards the top. And then we have date on the x-axis, so over here we start in May and go all the way through August, where we end in this red area. And so when the birds first arrive, it's very loud because the birds are establishing territory and participating in mateship or in mating behavior, which is very loud. And then as they begin to lay their eggs, it gets quieter. Eggs don't make a whole lot of noise unless you put them right up to your ear right before they hatch. So it gets nice and quiet. And then as the chicks begin to hatch around mid-June, we see it starts to get louder. Chicks are making parent-offspring communication, as are the adults. And then as they begin to reach their juvenile stage, they have all the vocalizations that the full-grown adults do. So it gets quite a bit noisier. And then we have this nice decline as they leave and migrate south for the summer, and it gets very quiet again. So this allows us not only to look at how many birds are there, but what they're doing, which is also really important for researchers to understand, because things like climate change may affect this in the future and may change when these things are happening. All right, and to wrap things up, I just want to give an overview of why we study acoustics to begin with. So hopefully I've communicated these things in my presentation, but acoustics can give us insight into really important things like migration patterns, how populations and colonies are doing, the behavioral responses to things like disturbance, and when animals are reproducing. And long-term, using these methods, we can understand how populations are growing and declining, how they're responding to climate change, and overall how their ecosystems are doing. I have a whole lot of people to thank for helping me with this. Science is not done alone. I could not have done any of this by myself. Had many people help me throughout the entire process. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions, and I want to thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and we have so many questions already. If anyone has questions while we're going through these ones, feel free to keep putting them in the chat. But we'll start off. Oh my gosh, where do I even start? We'll start off. I did see a question about the recording devices. So they send the information directly to your computers, or do you have to go back and get them from where you place them?
Yeah, great question. So I wish they sent it to my computer. There are some really fancy recorders that can do that. The ones I use do not do that. So we have to actually go back, get the recorder, and take out what's called SD cards to get the data off it. And we have to do that every 4 to 6 weeks or so, which is not too bad.
Right. And then we had some questions specifically about the different lifespans of animals,
Yes.
and kind of their functionings. So one question was, how many different types of bats are there? And also, how does echolocation work?
Oh, great questions. So as of last week, actually, there are over 1,500 species of bats. So they just discovered the 1,500th species in Africa. So that's very exciting. And echolocation is so cool. So it works by, I'm going to use bats as the example because that's what I'm most familiar with. So bats make what's called an echolocation call. It's a very click-like sound, and then they listen for that call to come back. And they can actually tell a lot about their environment by how the call changes from the time they produced it to how it sounds when it comes back to them. So they can get information on how far away things are, on the size of things, so they can tell whether it's an insect or a branch. If it's an insect, they obviously want to go try and eat it. If it's a branch, they need to move so that they don't run into it. And they can even, from studies they've done in the lab, bats and dolphins can tell different textures apart, which is also very cool.
Nice. Another question about bats is, what do they have for predators?
Yeah, so it depends on the species. There's so many different types of bats that live in all sorts of different environments, but the most common predators you're going to run into are birds, so birds of prey like hawks and eagles. Especially when these bats are emerging, they'll kind of the hawks and the eagles will hang out and kind of swoop down and pick them off. One of the most interesting things I've ever seen that I didn't realize until I started studying these bats, snakes will also eat bats. So at certain bat caves, they put up these gates to protect the bats from people going in and out of the cave. And towards the top of the gate, there's usually a gap where the bats are able to come out of. And snakes will climb up the gate and wait right at the top where the bats are coming out, and they will sit there and wait to pick off the bats as they fly out of the cave, which is just nature is crazy.
Yeah, I never would have thought that.
No.
Kind of related, we have questions about both bats and terns, but how long do they live for?
So both bats and terns can live up to 30 to 40 years, which is crazy. So for bats, it depends on the species. The longest living bat that was ever recorded was 41 years. Common terns specifically tend to live between 30 to 40 years.
Cool. And then some questions about terns as well.
Mhm.
When you showed that heat map of the nesting islands, we had
Yes.
one question about just wondering if you have any idea why they kind of made an X shape with their nests, where they seem.
Yes. So I'll pull that slide back up for people. So it's not necessarily that they make the X shape with their nest. That's just how we decided to deploy our recorders so that we could capture a wide variety of nest densities. So realistically, when we plot all of the birds nesting on the island, it covers the majority of the island. So it's much more of a blob shape and much less of an X shape. But we just did this so that we could catch all sorts of different nest densities. So we have these low nest density areas and these high nest density areas. And that was important for answering our questions that we had those specific types of areas in our data set.
Okay. And then sort of related to that one, there was a question from Eddy Middle School. How do you decide when the disturbance of the colonies is worth the data collection?
Yeah, that's a really hard thing that we as researchers deal with. So, in general, there's researchers that live on this island throughout the entire summer breeding season to study these animals. And they try and reduce the amount of time they spend in the colony as much as possible while retaining the information that we know is important to protect these animals. So we need to understand, for example, how many birds are there, so that we can get funding from the federal and local government to actually support the conservation efforts to maintain the colony. So they do restoration on the island, for example. So we need that data to be able to get money to maintain the health of that island. But there are some ways we can mitigate or lessen the disturbance while we are out there. So For example, if researchers want to go out there and just sit and observe the animals to understand different behaviors and how they're responding to different things, we have what are called bird blinds, which are basically these little sheds that they build in the middle of these colonies where we can walk through the colony and sit in that blind and they can't see us. And so then they're not quite as upset that we're out there because we can't see us or they can't see us or hear us, and we can just sit and watch them without disturbing them.
Cool. Um, what was your interest in becoming a scientist? Like, how did you decide that's what you wanted to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was around when I was in middle school that I really started to become interested in biology. I was especially interested in marine biology when I was in middle school, so like coral reefs and fish, which is obviously not the path I took. But as I continued throughout my education in high school and in college, I just kept taking more and more classes in biology because that's what I enjoyed. Like I had fun in those classes. And it just kind of naturally led me down this path. I just kept taking all the opportunities that came my way to get involved with these things that excited me. And I'm really fortunate that I had those opportunities at the schools I was at. But really, what got me down this path specifically was during my undergrad degree, like I talked about in the very beginning, getting involved in those different research projects and learning about the different ways that animals use sound to communicate, but also just broadly these crazy different animal behaviors that I had never paid attention to until I had the opportunity to learn about them in the classroom.
Great. Yeah, so just following what brings you joy and
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome. We had a few questions about the equipment that you use.
Mhm.
Like what size, how much memory do the cards that you put in your recording devices have to
Yeah.
hold? That's a big one.
Yeah. So it depends. For the turns, so for both bats and terns, I use a recording device called an audio moth. And actually, I'm going to go back to my bat slide because I have these little green guys are what they look like. They're about the size of a GoPro, if people are familiar with that. For the bats, because they make such high frequency vocalizations, it actually takes a larger amount of data to record the same amount of time that it would for lower frequency vocalizations. So I need bigger SD cards for this. Usually, if I'm recording for a few hours, which is usually how long their emergences can last if we want to capture the entire thing, my SD cards are about 64 gigabytes, which is a lot for such a short period of time. For the turns, because they are not making ultrasonic vocalizations, they make vocalizations within our hearing range. I don't need to collect, I don't collect as much data. So here's another picture of what the audio moths look like when they're deployed on the island. So to record for 4 to 6 weeks, I use the same size SD card. Keep in mind, I'm only recording 10 minutes every hour, every day for that 4 to 6 week period. But yeah, about 64 gigabytes to record for about a month.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's like the size of my phone storage.
Yeah, it's a lot of data.
Yeah, a lot. And then we had some questions about bat species. So one was, how can you tell the difference between species, like one species of bat from another? And then would two species be able to talk to each other or communicate with each other?
I love that second question. I'll start with the first. So it can be very hard to tell different species of bats, especially if we're trying to do it in the field when we're not able to like hold them side by side and look for visual differences in the actual characteristics of the bats, so how they look different. Some species of bat you're able to tell apart by their echolocation calls. So their echolocation calls for different species have different characteristics in their shapes or timing or frequency range. And so that's the most common way, but for closely related species, it does get very complicated, and they're still working out ways to best identify species. Obviously, if you have the actual bat like in your hand and you're able to hold them side by side, you can just look and tell the difference, kind of like with different breeds of dog. Like you can visually see differences. And then the second question, can you remind me of the second question, actually? Sorry.
Just yeah, so would they be able to talk to each other?
Yes. Oh, that's such a fun question. I have no clue. I don't think anyone knows for sure if different species can talk to each other. We know that bats within the same species have social calls that they use to communicate with each other,
Mhm.
but that is such an interesting question, and I hope that someone studies that one day because I would love to know the answer to that.
Yeah, I know with songbirds, sometimes they maybe don't talk in like to each other, but they
Yep.
understand what their each other's alarm calls means, so they
Yep.
can warn each other at least. So
Yep.
that would be maybe one of you all can do the research to figure
I'll
that
see what I can do.
out. Um, there's another question about what bats and common terns eat, and then one more about your life. What is the farthest you've traveled to study the species that you study?
Awesome. Okay, so terns eat mostly small fish and sometimes shrimp, sometimes like small squids. So they fly over the water and they swoop down and they just kind of snatch up very small fish to eat. The adults can eat fish that are a little bit larger, but the chicks are so itty bitty, they need very small fish so that they swallow them whole. So they need to be able to get them down in one bite. And bats, it is very species dependent. They eat everything. So most bats that we have in New England, or all bats we have in New England, are insectivores, so they eat insects. But across the globe, there are bats that eat fish, fruit, nectar, and of course, everyone I think is familiar with vampire bats that eat blood. I mentioned there are 1,500 species of bats. Only three of those species are bats that eat blood. So that's very small amount of the number of bats. But yeah, they eat just about anything. And then, yes, how far have I traveled for my research? I'm based in New Hampshire. All of the data I collected for the gray bats was collected in Missouri. So that is the farthest I've traveled for that. All of the seabird data was just off the coast of New Hampshire, so about 6 miles off the coast, which is not too far. And I also helped some of my lab mates collect data in the White Mountains.
Great. Um, and then another question is, what is your favorite animal to study?
That is such a hard question. But I think my favorite animal that I've studied is squirrels. They have so much attitude. I love listening to all the crazy sounds they make. Even to this day, I will go sit outside and watch them. They're just such sassy animals. They love to chase each other around and just scream their little heads off. And I just get a kick out of watching them.
Awesome. Yeah, squirrels have I I will use like sound to identify birds when I go out,
Mhm.
just as one of my hobbies, and squirrels cause a ruckus every time.
Yep.
And it confuses my bioacoustics detector, which is my phone,
Yes.
very frequently. But yeah,
Yep.
squirrels are very cool to watch too.
Absolutely. Chipmunks too. Chipmunks can
Oh
sound a
yeah.
lot like cardinals, which is very tricky sometimes.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I managed to get a question from every person that asked one. I hope I
Awesome.
was able to. Um, but I think for the sake of time, we can sort of wrap it up. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. Thank you, everyone, for joining.